October 21st, 1954. Verdun, Quebec. 9-year-old Clifford Sherwood leaves for school, but never arrives or returns home, and it turns out that he met up with a 12-year-old friend named George Gumbly, who has also gone missing. Clifford's mother, Frances Sherwood, believes that her abusive ex-husband, Nephi Sherwood, abducted Clifford and took him to British Columbia, but there is no evidence to implicate him. When Tex passes away 3 decades later, it turns out that he had been living under a false identity and led a secret double life. While this creates speculation that he may have raised Clifford under a new identity, no trace of Clifford or George is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I'm going to be exploring the oldest registered missing children's case from my home country of Canada, the 1954 disappearances of Clifford Sherwood and George Gumbly. I've received numerous requests to cover this story by multiple listeners over the years, and since I'm going to be participating in a pair of live shows in Toronto and Ottawa these next 2 weeks, I thought now would be an ideal time to do an episode about a Canadian cold case which is pretty close to home for me. Since Clifford's mother, Frances Sherwood, was a major advocate for Canada's Missing Children's Network and kept his case in the spotlight for several decades, I distinctly remember seeing Clifford's missing poster in public for years during my childhood, and his story always stuck with me since he happened to go missing on my birthday. This story was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, but since the original segment has not been uploaded for viewing on either Amazon Prime or YouTube, that only made me extra motivated to tackle it. The Unsolved Mysteries segment is a bit controversial because they focused all of their attention on Clifford, but barely acknowledged George Gumbly, the boy who went missing alongside him, and pretty much treated George as a complete afterthought. Frances Sherwood always believed that Clifford was abducted by his estranged father and raised under a new identity, but if that's the case, what happened to George? This case is a major rabbit hole, and I should also give a major shout out to my friend Crystal Dawn, who wrote an extensive article about this case at her website, lostandfoundblogs.com, and managed to uncover some new information. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearances of Clifford Sherwood and George Gumbly. Our story begins in 1954 in Verdun, Quebec, a suburb of Montreal. One of our central figures is 9-year-old Clifford Edward Sherwood, who is being raised by his single mother, Frances Sherwood. On the morning of October 21st, Clifford said goodbye to his mother and left their apartment to head for Ballantyne School. He soon bumped into his best friend Butch, and they started walking to school together, but it wasn't long before they crossed paths with a 12-year-old friend of Clifford's named George Gumbly. Clifford and George stopped to have a private conversation and told Butch to go on ahead without them. They said they would meet him at school, but after Butch left, this would turn out to be the last time Clifford and George were confirmed to be alive. Neither boy arrived at school that day, or returned home. By the time 8 p.m. rolled around, Clifford still had not surfaced, and Frances Sherwood grew extremely concerned, so she attempted to call the police and report her son missing. However, she was told they could not do anything until Clifford was gone for at least 48 hours. The following day, Clifford's aunt, Hilda, received an odd phone call from a boy who stuttered out the words, "Auntie, Auntie Hilda," before the line went dead. Since Clifford spoke with a distinct stutter, Hilda seemed certain that the caller was him. When the 48-hour waiting period finally passed, and Frances was able to file a missing persons report, the police initially held the attitude that Clifford and George had run away together and would eventually resurface. But neither family believed this, as both boys had left all their personal belongings behind. Clifford had not even taken his jacket with him, while George left behind his bicycle, as well as some money he had saved up in a bedroom drawer. Once their disappearances were publicized in the media, eyewitnesses came forward who thought they had seen the two boys hitchhiking in the Vaudreuil suburb of Montreal on October the 23rd, and one of them was carrying a rifle. 1 week earlier, a group of boys had broken into a local store and stolen a rifle, but Clifford and George's families did not believe they were involved. There was also an odd sighting from a gas station attendant in the city of St. Jerome, who reported seeing two boys climbing out of the trunk of a car with Ontario license plates. The vehicle was being driven by a man and a woman, and the boys climbed into the back seat before it drove away. I've read two differing accounts on this lead. One is that the vehicle was listed as belonging to a resident from Windsor, Ontario, who could not be found. The other is that it was traced to a man in Cornwall, Ontario, who claimed his kids often liked to ride in the trunk of his car. Well, Frances did not believe Clifford would have run away voluntarily, and immediately directed suspicion towards his estranged father, Nephi Sherwood, who went by the nickname Tex. Frances and Tex had originally met in Ontario in 1940 while he was stationed with the Canadian Army. Even though Tex was nearly 20 years older than Frances, they soon got married and settled down to raise a family in Toronto, which included Clifford and 4 daughters named Colleen, Carol, Clara, and Claudia. While the relationship was relatively happy at first, Tex eventually started to show a darker side as he drank too much and became jealous and abusive towards Frances, often accusing her of cheating on him. It was common practice for Tex to go out drinking with his friends until late at night and expect Frances to have dinner ready for him on the table when he arrived home. If she didn't, Tex would beat her. Things hit a breaking point when Frances became pregnant for the 6th time in 1950. Well, in her 5th month, complications arose after she was admitted to the hospital for a serious case of peritonitis. The doctor advised Frances to terminate the pregnancy in order to avoid risking her life, so she elected to do so and lost her child, which turned out to be a son. Well, Tex became so angry by Frances's decision that he decided to end the marriage. When Frances left the hospital on New Year's Day in 1951, Tex immediately kicked her out of the house and gave her a one-way train ticket to Montreal to stay with her mother. By this point, Clifford had already been sent there as well, so Frances traveled to Montreal to join him. Frances was only allowed to say goodbye to their oldest daughter, Colleen, and she would soon learn that Tex had taken their 4 girls and relocated to the other side of the country in Vancouver, British Columbia. Since Tex was often away from home, he left his daughters in the care of a housekeeper, but only 4 months after they arrived, she was arrested on drug charges. As a result, the 4 girls were removed from the home and placed in foster care. For some reason, Tex had elected not to take Clifford with him to Vancouver, so Frances would be responsible for his care. She moved into a new apartment in Verdun and raised Clifford as a single mother. Even though his other children had been taken away, Tex would sometimes still make the 4,500-kilometer trek from Vancouver to Montreal in order to visit Clifford. Frances claimed that she never refused Tex's request to see his son, aside from one occasion where he phoned her at 10 p.m. But now she suspected that Tex had abducted Clifford and took him back to Vancouver. Police did question Tex, but could find no evidence he was involved in the disappearances of Clifford or George. Even though Frances heard that Tex had been spotted in a Montreal hotel during the same week the boys went missing, he was apparently able to prove that he was on the West Coast at that time, so investigators ruled him out as a suspect. But there would be some other developments in the case. In May of 1955, Police received an anonymous letter where the writers claimed they were a pair of 17-year-old women. They wrote that the boys' disappearance was connected to another case involving a woman who had owned a flower shop in the Ville-Émard neighborhood near Verdun. I was able to find one newspaper article which referred to her as Mrs. Edward Pigeon, and the story goes that in September of 1954, Mrs. Pigeon sold her flower shop and moved to Beauharnois alongside her husband and 7 children. But then for unknown reasons, she subsequently returned to Verdun and rented out a flat for a few weeks before she inexplicably vanished sometime in October. The anonymous writers claimed they had seen Clifford and George with Mrs. Pigeon shortly before they went missing. They also wrote that the 2 boys had worked as messengers at Mrs. Pigeon's flower shop, but Francis said this was not true. As far as I can tell, this lead never went anywhere, and I have no idea if Mrs. Pigeon was ever found. Later that same year, Francis was called to the morgue by police because a badly decomposed lower torso belonging to an unidentified boy had been found in the St. Lawrence River near the town of Sorel, located over 90 kilometers northwest of Montreal. Police estimated that the victim was Clifford's approximate age and height and wondered if it might be his torso, so they wanted Francis to positively identify it as her son and sign a statement. Francis was given a description of the torso, but claimed that she could not bring herself to actually look at it. However, based on the description the police provided, she did not believe the torso belonged to Clifford and refused to sign the statement identifying him. It's unclear what happened to this torso or if it was eventually identified, but Francis continued to cling on to the hope that Clifford had been abducted by his father and might still be alive somewhere. Even though he no longer had custody of his 4 daughters, Tex still continued to maintain contact with them for the next few years. But they would later say that Clifford's disappearance was a completely taboo subject around their father. If they ever talked about Clifford, Tex would usually get angry and start smashing things. By the time 1962 rolled around, Tex pretty much broke off all contact with his family and dropped out of sight. Frances would eventually reunite with her daughters and rekindle her relationships with them, and she also got remarried and became attached to some new stepchildren. The investigation into Clifford's disappearance remained at a standstill, but Tex's daughter, Colleen, was able to track down her father again in 1976. He was now living at a rundown hotel in Chilliwack, British Columbia, but Colleen was surprised to discover that he was registered under the name Edward Thorne. When Colleen questioned him about this, Tex said that when he was 14 years old, he wanted to join the military and serve in World War I, but because he was too young, he wound up enlisting under the name and birth date of his neighbor, Edward Walter Thorne. In order to remain eligible for his pension from the Department of Veteran Affairs, Tex said he had to continue using that name long after he retired. Tex passed away in October of 1987 at the age of 87, but never revealed anything about Clifford. However, while going through her father's belongings after his death, Colleen made a surprising discovery. She found a photograph of Tex and Clifford together where she believed that Clifford looked older than 9 years old, which was his age when he went missing. Colleen also uncovered a second photograph of Clifford standing alone, and when she showed it to her mother, Frances claimed she did not recognize the clothes Clifford was wearing, making her suspect that both photos were taken in the year following Clifford's disappearance. They also found a letter Tex had written to Clifford, which was dated September the 22nd, 1951. It read, quote, "Daddy has not forgotten about you by any means. He was in Montreal to see you at the park, but no such luck. Anyway, I will be coming back, and will make it up for not being able to see you the last time." End quote. Well, even though Frances had allowed Tex to visit their son in Montreal on multiple occasions, she was apparently unaware of this aforementioned visit in the park, which made her suspect that Tex had secretly been meeting with Clifford without her knowledge. Tex's daughter Claudia would also describe an odd story she heard from him years before his death. Tex told her about an incident where he was drinking in a Legion Hall in Edmonton, Alberta, when a man suddenly approached him and said, quote, "I'm your son, Clifford." Tex claimed he was too drunk to carry on a conversation at that time, so he asked the man to come back later, but he never did. Anyway, the revelation that Tex had served in the military under a false name fueled speculation that he might have raised Clifford under a new identity and that he might still be alive somewhere. Colleen paid a visit to the Department of Veteran Affairs office in hopes of gaining access to Tex's military file, which was listed under the name Edward Walter Thorne. When the employee she was speaking with received a computer printout of a document from Edward Thorne's file, Colleen glanced over at it and noticed that it listed him as being unmarried and having no children. However, since Colleen could not prove that she was actually Edward Thorne's daughter, she was denied access to his file, which would remain sealed for 20 years following his death before it became public record. It's unclear whether anyone from the Sherwood family saw the file after the 20-year waiting period passed, but if they did, it likely didn't offer any further insight into what might have happened to Clifford. Another odd development took place when one of Clifford's sisters started a new job, which required a security check for herself and her family. During this check, a record was uncovered for a driver's license that had been issued to someone named Edward Clifford Sherwood in 1987. Even though the first and middle names were reversed, this person's birth date was listed as March 30th, 1945, which just happened to be Clifford's birth date. The license contained an address for an apartment building in Edmonton, Alberta, but when investigators checked into it, they learned that Edward Clifford Sherwood had moved away and did not leave a forwarding address. By this point, the apartment had already been sold twice since the license was originally issued, so there didn't seem to be any tenant records for Mr. Sherwood or anyone who remembered him. The case would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in October of 1992, which led to two surprising tips from viewers. The first one was from a former waitress who claimed that she had seen Clifford and Tex together in British Columbia in 1960. She said that Clifford often used to play with her sons until both he and his father suddenly just took off and left town without explanation. But the most surprising tip was provided by someone who knew a man that they suspected might be Clifford Sherwood, and bear with me here because this is going to get a bit complicated. This man was eventually tracked down, and while he was not Clifford Sherwood, his name was Clifford, and it turned out he was also the biological son of Tex Sherwood. Well, long story short, this revelation helped bring about a ton of additional collaborative research into Tex's life, and it would lead to one of the biggest rabbit holes ever. As you recall, Tex had claimed that he used the name Edward Walter Thorne in order to enlist in the military, but in actuality, Edward Walter Thorne was his real name. He was originally born under that name in London, Ontario in 1900, and by the time he met Frances in 1940, he was living as Nephi Tex Sherwood, which was a completely false name. It's unclear what exactly happened at what time, but over the course of his life, Tex/Edward is believed to have gotten married at least 7 times, but only officially got divorced from one of his wives. 5 of his marriages took place in Canada, while the others took place in Texas and Michigan, and he fathered children with at least 3 of these women. What was particularly bizarre is that Tex liked to give his children from different families the same names, which is why he had another biological son out there named Clifford. This other Clifford did eventually get to meet with Frances Sherwood and many of his half-siblings, but he apparently did not have a relationship with his father. Given that Tex Sherwood/Edward Walter Thorne ultimately died alone in a rundown hotel, it seems like he had a habit of abandoning the numerous families he started. Of course, all these discoveries about Tex's secret double life continued to give Frances hope that Clifford might be alive under a new identity. As the years went on, she never stopped lobbying for her son, but she had to go through the tragedy of losing another child when Colleen passed away in 2003. Frances herself would finally pass away on January the 7th, 2009, at the age of 90, and she remained living in the same apartment in Verdun on the off chance Clifford might return someday. Frances had become the poster mom for Canada's Missing Children's Network and participated in their annual telethons every year. Following Frances's death, the network's director stated, quote, "She was an exceptional woman who truly exemplified courage, dignity, and strength," end quote. But she never did receive the answers she was looking for, and after nearly 65 years, the disappearances of Clifford and George Gumbly continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. Okay, right before I started working on this episode, the main promise I made to myself was that I wouldn't completely ignore George Gumbly. While Clifford Sherwood had a very convoluted family backstory, there's virtually no information out there about George. Ever since I first watched it, I always felt there was something off about the Unsolved Mystery segment, which might explain why it was never uploaded when the seasons went on Amazon Prime and is currently unavailable for viewing online. It was not common for the show to focus on cold cases which were several decades old, let alone one that took place in Canada, so this might explain why the segment was billed as a lost loves case rather than a missing persons one. The lost loves segments often focused on stories where children were separated from their families, but were still believed to be alive all these years later. This case was pretty much treated as the story of a boy who was taken from his mother by his estranged father, not as a missing children's case where foul play had taken place. God bless her, I have nothing but the utmost sympathy for Frances Sherwood, who seemed like such a sweet, classy woman who had to endure a tragic and rough life. She suffered through an abusive marriage, had her daughters taken away from her by her husband, and then she had to lose her son. But then she decided to spend the later years of her life becoming an advocate for the Missing Children's Network and bringing awareness to cases in which other families had to go through the same thing. However, Frances also had her own idea about what happened to her missing son, and I cannot blame her for sticking to it, since it gave her hope that Clifford was still alive somewhere. But the problem is that Unsolved Mysteries seemed content to present this story entirely from Frances's perspective and put all the focus on her personal theory. If there were any facts which didn't quite fit this narrative, they were conveniently pushed to the side. And unfortunately, that included the disappearance of George Gumbly, who was literally treated as a complete afterthought by the show. They casually mention that Clifford went off with his friend George before they disappeared together, but they provide no information about George or his family, or make any attempt to explore what might have happened to him. This is reminiscent about another Unsolved Mysteries segment which aired around this time period, about a 7-year-old boy named Scott Johnson who was killed alongside his friend after being trapped inside a burning shack in Arizona in 1974. The death was officially ruled an accident, and Scott's family was convinced the boys were murdered, but the bizarre thing is that the name of Scott's friend was not even mentioned at all during this segment. I've heard rumors that the other boy's family had accepted the original accident ruling and declined to participate in the show, so I wondered if there might have been a similar situation with George Gumbly's family. However, if you go to the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, you'll find a thread about this case containing a couple of posts from a user named Mustang Dang who claims they are George Gumbly's cousin. I should also mention that for her article about this case at lostandfoundblogs.com, Crystal Dawn spoke to another relative of George's who corroborated much of the information in Mustang Dan's posts. These posts were originally made in January of 2009, in the days following Frances Sherwood's death, and Mustang Dan claimed that one of George's brothers told him that he had been contacted by the producers of Unsolved Mysteries at the time they made the segment, but the family never heard back from them, and were quite surprised by the lack of attention given to George in the episode. He also claimed that the Missing Children's Network would put on a yearly telethon to raise money, and always brought on Frances Sherwood as a guest to talk about her missing son, but once again, George was completely ignored. According to Mustang Dan, George's father remained in the same house for the rest of his life, on the off chance George might return someday. However, it seems like the Gumbly family always believed that Clifford and George were the victims of an accidental drowning. They suspected that the boys decided to skip school that day in order to visit a lake located in Angringnum Park, which was a popular fishing spot for children at that time. It's possible that one of the boys fell in the water and the other one tried to save him, but they both wound up drowning. The Gumbly family apparently asked the police to dredge the fishing hole, but they refused to do so, because they thought the boys had simply ran away and would return soon. The family also didn't discount the possibility that Clifford and George might have fallen into the nearby St. Lawrence River, because as you recall, a boy's lower torso was found in the river the following year. Other than what his family shared in these posts, there is still very little info about George online, and the only available photograph is an incredibly blurry one that I included as part of the episode's cover photo. I mean, it sounds like George's family was content to accept that he simply drowned, but they still wanted conclusive answers about what happened to him. Obviously, an accidental drowning would completely go against Francis Sherwood's theory about an abduction, meaning that unsolved mysteries might have made a calculated decision to pretty much ignore George's role in the story since it did not fit their narrative, which is pretty sad. The fact of the matter is that the theory about Clifford being kidnapped by his non-custodial father and being raised on the other side of the country under a new identity makes a lot less sense once you factor in George's involvement. If Tex did abduct Clifford, what happened to George? It seems very unlikely that Tex would have gone to the trouble of abducting an additional 12-year-old boy who had no connection to him, but could Tex have gone so far as to kill George because he was a witness? Well, there's no doubt that Tex was a pretty lousy human being, as he was abusive towards Frances throughout their marriage and stole her 4 daughters away from her because she dared make the decision to terminate a pregnancy which was jeopardizing her life. It's never really been explained why Tex allowed Clifford to go to Montreal and stay with his mother. Maybe Tex did not care that much about his son at first, but developed a newfound interest in Clifford after his other daughters were taken away and placed in foster care. But the problem with believing that Tex orchestrated an abduction is that he lived on the other side of the country in British Columbia, over 4,500 kilometers away. Well, Frances claimed that Tex had been spotted at a Montreal hotel in the week prior to Clifford's disappearance. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that Tex made a lengthy cross-country trip at that time. While no specifics were provided, the sources say that when police questioned Tex, he was able to provide proof that he was on the West Coast when Clifford went missing, which, if true, seems to completely destroy the narrative of him committing an abduction. To be fair, this was an era when law enforcement seemed content to write off most missing children as runaways and would not even begin an investigation until they were gone at least 48 hours. So it's possible that they did not investigate Tex's alibi as thoroughly as they should have. While I used to completely discount the possibility of Tex being the perpetrator, the revelations I've recently learned about his bizarre double life have caused me to rethink things a little bit. It turns out that Tex Sherwood was a completely fictional creation, and his real name was Edward Walter Thorne, and he apparently married no less than 7 women throughout the course of his life, and fathered a number of different children. And since he often liked to give the children from each of his different families the same names, it turns out that he had more than one son named Clifford, which only adds additional confusion to the story. Not many specific details have been released about these other families of his, though his listing at the Find a Grave website under Edward Walter Thorne says he was once married to a woman named Marjorie Mills, and they had 4 children named Clifford, Edward, Colleen, and Hazel. I have no idea if this marriage took place before he married Frances, but I'd love to know what made him stop being Edward Walter Thorne and become Nephi Tex Sherwood. During the research, Clifford's family apparently uncovered an FBI report that an Edward Walter Thorne had once escaped from a Michigan prison before he was recaptured in Toronto and sent back, so this might be what prompted him to assume a new identity. Even with all these different families, he died alone in 1987, so it seems like he had a pattern of marrying women, having children with them, and then just deciding to abandon them. This might explain why Tex broke off all contact with his 4 daughters from his marriage to Frances in 1962 and just dropped out of sight for the next 14 years. So it almost sounds like if anyone could uncover all the details about Tex's backstory, you could probably put together an entire podcast episode about his life. Given what we now know about Tex, I guess I can't completely discount the possibility that he could have decided to kidnap Clifford and raised him under a new identity. For her Lost and Found blogs article, Crystal Dawn actually spoke to a private investigator who worked on Clifford's case, and he apparently obtained information that Clifford had been boarding with a family named Morgan in Chilliwack, British Columbia from 1956 until 1959, and that he was told his mother died of cancer. He also claimed that there were often unconfirmed sightings of Clifford over the years, but whenever someone tried to confirm it, the person believed to be Clifford would suddenly disappear. This investigator has theorized that when Tex met up with Clifford on the day he went missing, something bad happened to George, and for this reason, Clifford did not want to be found. Crystal Dawn also spoke to the daughter of the aforementioned other man named Clifford, who was Tex's biological son, and she shared another interesting story she heard from her father. When Tex died, there were apparently no private papers or records with his belongings. He usually kept this material in the trunk of his car, but it caught fire shortly before his death. But before we explore this abduction theory any further, let's go back and start at the very beginning. We do know that the last confirmed sighting of Clifford and George was from their friend Butch, who was walking to school with them before they stopped to have a conversation and told Butch they'd catch up with them later. It's highly unlikely that Clifford and George were making plans to run away, because they left all their personal belongings at home, and Clifford did not even bring his jacket along, but it's perfectly plausible that they could have planned to skip school that day. Like I mentioned earlier, the theory which George's family leaned towards is that the two boys went off to a popular fishing spot in Grignon Park, but may have fallen into the lake or the St. Lawrence River and drowned. I'm not sure they were planning to spend the day fishing, since they didn't bring any fishing poles or gear with them, but they still could have played hooky and wound up near a body of water at some point. I know there were alleged sightings of the two boys together in the area in the days following their disappearance, but like I've said many times before, you have to take eyewitness sightings in missing persons cases with a huge grain of salt, because witnesses can be mistaken about who they see all the time. One of the weirdest leads is the anonymous letter which stated that the boys had been seen in the company of another missing woman from the area named Mrs. Pigeon. I've tried really hard to find out more information about this disappearance, because it sounds like a pretty intriguing case on its own. From the sound of things, within the course of a few weeks, Mrs. Pigeon sold her flower shop in Verdun and relocated her entire family to another section of Montreal before she inexplicably moved into a flat in Verdun and vanished. I know it was initially reported that Clifford and George worked as messengers at Mrs. Pigeon's flower shop, but Francis denied this, and it doesn't look like there's any connection between Mrs. Pigeon and the two boys. In all likelihood, this lead is probably false, but some people have tried to connect it to the sighting from the gas station attendant in St. Jerome, who said he saw two boys climbing out of the trunk of a car driven by a man and a woman. Believe it or not, I've actually seen speculation that Tex and Mrs. Pigeon were the man and woman, and they worked together to drive Clifford and George out of town, but that just sounds absurd. While there's also been contradictory reporting on the gas station sighting, it seems likely that it was two entirely different boys. I really wish I had more information about Mrs. Pigeon, or whether or not she was found, but her case likely has no relevance to this story. The other major development was the discovery of the decomposed lower torso of a boy in the St. Lawrence River over 90 kilometers outside of Montreal. The police wanted Francis to sign a statement in which he positively identified the torso as belonging to Clifford, but she refused to even look at it and just concluded it wasn't him based on the description. I know that Francis has received some flack for this decision, but I certainly understand her reluctance to look at a partial dead body which may have belonged to her son. And the thing is, even if Francis did look at the torso, how was she supposed to know if it belonged to Clifford? This was nothing more than a lower torso, so unless Clifford had some distinctive birthmarks around that area, how could she be 100% certain it was him? I mean, I know this was over 30 years before DNA testing, and they obviously couldn't use dental records, so it's not like they had many options for identification. I think the police were probably hoping that Francis would just sign the statement and allow them to get a couple of unsolved cases off their books, because without her identification, there was probably no way to conclusively determine who that torso belonged to. But that doesn't necessarily mean it didn't belong to Clifford, or even George for that matter, as it's unclear if anyone from the Gumbly family was asked to look at it and make an identification. I do wonder if the torso might still be available today in order to test its DNA against surviving members of the Sherwood or Gumbly families. Remember, one of the primary theories is that the boys drowned in the St. Lawrence River, so it's not implausible that the current could have taken the remains 90 kilometers away. Or even worse, someone murdered one or both of the boys and disposed of the remains in the river. I would be interested to know if there were any other young boys who went missing in that region of Quebec during this time period, because if the torso did not belong to either Clifford or George, then who did it belong to? I guess the biggest piece of evidence which goes against the idea of Clifford drowning was the phone call his aunt received the day after he went missing, in which a boy asked for Auntie Hilda with Clifford's distinctive stutter before the line went dead. This took place before Clifford was officially reported missing, and his disappearance hadn't even made the news yet, so it seems odd that someone would be inclined to make a prank phone call like that. And none of the sources I saw specifically state where Aunt Hilda actually lived, so how many people would have even known she was Clifford's aunt? On the other hand, if the caller was Clifford, and he was attempting to phone for help, why would he phone his aunt instead of his mother? I really am not sure what to make of this call, but while it seems to indicate that Clifford was still alive the day after he went missing, that doesn't necessarily mean he was abducted by his father. Clifford could have easily been abducted by an unknown predator who subsequently murdered him and also murdered George as well. However, the other theory that I mentioned earlier, which at least one private investigator seems to believe, is that George might have been killed because he interfered with Tex's attempt to abduct Clifford, which has influenced Clifford's decision not to resurface all these years. But I don't know, even though Tex was known for being an abusive, violent person, would he really go so far as to murder a child he did not even know, and then dump his body into the river? It seems pretty extreme, but given the bizarre double life Tex led, I guess he was capable of anything. According to Frances, Tex did occasionally travel to Montreal to visit Clifford, and she almost always gave him permission to do so. But following Tex's death, a letter was found in which he wrote about seeing Clifford at a park in Montreal, and I'm guessing this was not a visit that Frances was aware of. So if Clifford had been having secret visits with his father, that may have influenced his decision to skip school on that particular day, but then again, why would he bring George along for something like that? What seems crazy to me is that Tex could take Clifford to the other side of the country and manage to keep him out of sight while raising him for the next several years. After all, Clifford was 9 years old by this point, and had spent the past 3 years being raised by his mother, so it's not like he wouldn't remember her, and he easily could have attempted to get in touch with Frances after he grew up, particularly since she remained at the same apartment for the rest of her life. This is why theories have been pushed around that either Tex lied to Clifford and told him his mother died of cancer, or something traumatic happened on the day Clifford disappeared, which compelled him to remain in hiding. Even though his daughters were taken away from him and placed in foster care, Tex did maintain contact with them until at least 1962. It doesn't sound like they saw any indication that Clifford was with them during that time period, though they claimed he became angry and violent if you ever mentioned Clifford's name. That could be interpreted as Tex hiding something, but he may have simply acted that way because he had a hard time dealing with the grief about the disappearance and possible death of his son. Of course, the darkest interpretation is that Tex wound up killing Clifford during his attempt to abduct him, and that was Clifford's torso, which was found in the St. Lawrence River. The most convincing piece of evidence that Clifford did relocate to British Columbia is the phone call from the woman who watched the Unsolved Mysteries segment and claimed that she remembered Clifford playing with her sons in 1960 until both he and his father abruptly took off. I wish there were more specific details about this woman's tip. How well did she and her sons know this boy? Did he actually refer to himself as Clifford Sherwood? You also have to remember that Clifford would have been a 15-year-old teenager by this point and looked considerably different, so if she didn't know this boy well, she easily could have mistaken him for someone else. Whatever the case, we have a 14-year period when Tex's whereabouts seemed to be unaccounted for, starting in 1962, until his daughter Colleen tracked him down in 1976. Clifford was 17 years old in 1962, so he would have been old enough to split from his father and go off living somewhere on his own. Years later, Tex shared a story with his daughter Claudia about how he was approached by a man in a Legion Hall in Edmonton who claimed to be Clifford, but Tex was too drunk to converse with him. But keep in mind, this story was shared third hand by Claudia, so we really only have Tex's word that this actually happened, and I wouldn't exactly put much stock in him telling the truth. Now, the photographs of Clifford found in Tex's possessions after his death, I'm not sure I'd put much stock in them either. I know Frances did not recognize the clothes Clifford was wearing, and felt that he looked older than 9 years old in the photos, which would seem to lend credence to the idea that they were taken after he originally went missing. But let's not forget that these photos weren't uncovered until over 3 decades later, and I'm not sure how sharp Frances's memories would have been about the clothes Clifford wore back then. To my untrained eye, when I compare those pictures to other photos of Clifford, I don't see any dramatic differences to make me certain that Clifford looked older than 9 years old. But there's a potential alternate explanation for why something might have felt off about these photos, and why Frances didn't recognize them. Since we now know that Tex had a bunch of other children with other women, could it be possible that the boy in the photo is not actually Clifford, but resembles him because they both had the same father? Occam's razor tells me that it probably is Clifford, but the revelation that Tex had a bunch of other kids somewhere throws everything for a loop. And most of Tex's other personal possessions were apparently destroyed when his car caught on fire, and if this was intentional, he probably would have been inclined to get rid of photos he took after he abducted Clifford. Given all the other secrets Tex seemed to have in his life, there are any number of reasons he may have decided to set that fire and get rid of evidence. The other piece of evidence which pointed to Clifford possibly being alive was the record of a driver's license registered to an Edward Clifford Sherwood in Edmonton who happened to share Clifford's exact birth date. And Edmonton is where Tex claimed he had the encounter with the man claiming to be Clifford. If you dig deep enough, you'll find a post from the early days of the internet in March of 1995 written by a woman named Kim Howitt who claims to be Clifford's niece. She shared a story about how her family got a friend who worked in a driver's license department to do a search on Edward Clifford Sherwood, and while she got a match, the police apparently came up with nothing when they performed a search a few weeks later. The post kind of devolves into a conspiratorial tone where she proposes a theory that Clifford had become involved with the government, which is why all the information about his identity was removed from the system. But I think that's a bit far-fetched. And could it be possible that the whole thing is nothing more than a coincidence? The world is a big place, and I'm sure that if you search hard enough, you can find a number of people who happen to share the same name and birth date, even though they have no other connection to each other. If the man in Edmonton was Clifford, and he was choosing to live under a false identity, you'd think he would select a better alias for himself, rather than simply switching his first and middle names around. I know that during the Unsolved Mystery segment, they made a big deal about the 20-year waiting period required to access Tex's military records following his death. His daughter Colleen was particularly anxious to see his records, but tragically, she passed away in 2003, so I hope that Frances, or at least someone else from his family, got access. If they did, they may have learned some more info about Tex's life, but nothing which would shed any light on what happened to Clifford. Ultimately, one of my biggest issues about Tex being responsible for Clifford's abduction is that he just seemed to have a pattern of getting married and starting families before he completely abandoned them. The other son I told you about named Clifford said that he didn't have any sort of relationship with his father, so what would make Tex suddenly decide he wanted to steal Clifford Sherwood from his mother and raise him? Yes, considering that he took Frances's daughters away from her, he could have decided to take Clifford away from her as well out of spite. But this was nearly 4 years after he originally ended the marriage, so what would suddenly compel him to travel 4,500 kilometers to commit an abduction? And then there's the issue of how this abduction would have been carried out. Clifford was supposed to be on his way to school on the morning he went missing, but he decided to change his routine and go off somewhere else with George. Unless he had been watching Clifford and following him from his apartment, how would Tex have known how to find him? And if Tex was following Clifford, why make an attempt to grab him while he was in the presence of another boy? Don't get me wrong, I do have reasons to be suspicious of Tex, but it would all depend on how solid his alibi was. If investigators were able to conclusively place him on the other side of the country on that particular day, then all the speculation is moot. Again, I believe that Frances so wanted to keep up hope that Clifford was still alive that she may have been willing to ignore potential evidence which ruled out her ex-husband. Otherwise, the alternatives may have been accepting the Gumbly family's theory that Clifford and George both drowned, or even worse, that they were killed by an unknown third party. I know that cases of young children being abducted and murdered were not as common back in the 1950s, but they still did happen. I think it would all depend on the condition of the lower torso found in the St. Lawrence River. There aren't many details about the torso, and it's unclear if it showed any signs of foul play. I would not be surprised if it did belong to either Clifford or George. If DNA testing could be performed, then this might be one of the best chances of solving this case, but I wouldn't hold my breath about the torso still being available. Anyway, while this story was a horrible tragedy for Frances Sherwood, and both she and her family deserve all the sympathy in the world, I do not want to forget that George was a victim too, and that his surviving family are still hoping for conclusive answers about what happened to him as well. Sadly, because of all the drama involving the Sherwood family, George has always been overlooked in this story, and while I didn't have too much information to share about him, I wanted to ensure he received adequate coverage. If Clifford and George are still alive, they would be in their mid to late 70s right now, though I don't have high hopes that this is the case. However, if you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearances of Clifford Sherwood and George Gumbly, please contact the National Missing Children Services of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at 1-877-318-3576. That's 1-877-318-3576. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Anyway, once again, I would like to give a plug to the website lostandfoundblogs.com, which features an extensive article about Clifford and George's disappearance, as well as some more detailed articles about some other prominent cold cases which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries. Also, another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past year, we produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this month, we've released a new episode about the unsolved murder of David Buller, a Canadian cold case from Toronto, which I covered during my live show at the True Crime Podcast Festival in Chicago last month. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also released another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon, and they are John M., Jessica R., Tom, and Barb R. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for another true crime podcast called Devil We Know.
The neighborhood is unsafe, the streets unlit. While others sleep soundly, you lie awake because you know the truth. You know that, no matter where you go, there's always a chance that a monster is in your midst. The darkness that runs deep within our own veins, the evil found in even the sweetest of souls, sometimes comes to light. And when it does, the result is a person that takes on that evil, that wears it proudly, and becomes part of the darkness itself. I am Aaron from Devil We Know podcast. And on our true crime show, we dive into the scariest corners of our past and present to reveal the devil we know. A father, a mother, a brother, a sister, and anyone, anywhere who hides in plain sight, living a life of bloody secrets while living just next door. Come check us out and hear the chilling, true stories about the devils we know.
Of course, this coming Sunday, August the 18th, I will be participating in the True Crime Podcasting event at the Royal Cinema in Toronto, and you can still purchase tickets for $25 each by clicking on the link to our website in our episode description. And next weekend, on Saturday, August the 24th, I will be doing another live show at the Ottawa Podcast Festival, an all-day event featuring live shows from a whole bunch of different local podcasts. The Trail Went Cold was originally scheduled to do a 1-hour show in the 7:30 p.m. slot that evening, but we will now be doing our show at 9:30 p.m. To learn more information or purchase tickets to the event, please visit their website at ottawapodcastfestival.com. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, as well as the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, which contains a number of interesting threads about today's case. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. Anyway, the next 2 weeks are going to be very exciting, and I hope to see some of you fine folks in Toronto this coming Sunday. Have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another new episode of The Trail Went Cold.